Hey guys, welcome to a new movie review. Today I'm going to be talking about the supposedly final Star Wars installment in the Skywalker Saga. This is Star Wars Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker. This is not only the end of this current trilogy, but like I said, this is kind of the finale of this overall Star Wars franchise. Yes, Disney has kind of announced that there'll be little spin off movies every once in a while. Rian Johnson, who worked on Star Wars The Last Jedi in 2017, I think he's still rumored to kind of make a Star Wars film of some kind at some point. Mandalorian might get a film at some point, and so the Star Wars films themselves are not done with, but the overall Skywalker saga, the films that deal with the Skywalker family in the Star Wars movies, are basically finished with this movie. So in Star Wars Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker, J.J. Abrams did return as both writer and director of this movie. Colin Trevorrow departed this film due to creative differences and from the death of Carrie Fisher, and really wasn't kind of able to fulfill his vision based on that tragic death of Carrie Fisher. But J.J. Abrams came back. He came back from The Force Awakens. He did not do Last Jedi. That was Rian Johnson. But he did direct this movie, and I believe Colin Trevorrow still got a screenwriting credit for this movie still. But in this movie, guys, this is obviously going to be as spoiler-free as I can make it, so I'm going to keep things as broad as possible. I even might try to prevent certain character names from being brought up here just to kind of keep this as broad as possible. And for those who still haven't seen the film yet, that'll give you a chance to see this movie and to still hear my opinion on the movie without kind of ruining anything. So in this overall film, without ruining too much, basically the main gist of this movie is that Rey and the Resistance are trying to hide from the First Order still. The First Order heard a voice of some kind from the past. It's clearly a character of Sith origins, I guess you can say. And they're trying to track down where this voice is coming from, what exactly this voice wants, and what planet this voice is coming from, because they don't really know exactly yet where this voice is coming from. So throughout the course of this film, the First Order, specifically Kylo Ren, is trying to find the voice, trying to find out what it wants, see if the mission of that voice kind of lines up with what he's trying to do at this point in time in the Star Wars franchise. While Rey and the Resistance are trying to survive, they're under the order of Leia Organa, who's the general still in this new trilogy. And since the death of Carrie Fisher happened in real life, they could only use so much archive footage from The Force Awakens in The Last Jedi to kind of really make it feel like she's there, even though she's not there. So they had to use a lot of CGI effects to kind of make a lot of this stuff happen, as announced when J.J. Abrams took on this movie at first. So basically, the main Justice movie, I would say, without giving away basically almost anything, really, is that Rey and the Resistance are trying to survive. The First Order is trying to win the war while trying to track down the voice and see if it can help them win the war. And it's basically a story of survival and who's going to come up on top and who's going to survive the big war towards the end of the movie. And hopefully the Force will live on in some way, some form, based off the events of Last Jedi, for those who might not even have seen that one yet. And hopefully the First Order will crash and fall once and for all. So overall, guys, Star Wars Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker, I really like this movie. For me personally, The Force Awakens, I think, is kind of my personal favorite of this newer trilogy. I liked Last Jedi. There were certain things that Rian Johnson did that I'm not a huge fan of. I thought he personified the Force in weird ways in that movie. He'd had some creative choices that weren't my all-time favorite on certain things, specifically with Luke Skywalker in that movie. But with Episode 9, it's a little bit more time that's passed since Last Jedi. Last Jedi took place pretty much immediately after Force Awakens ended. And I think there's things you can do creatively that aren't by the page, that you can kind of creatively get away with and things like that. But overall, for my overall feeling of this movie, I liked it. It's a fitting conclusion. They did wrap up all 9 films, not just this new trilogy, but all 9 films in a satisfying way. And I feel like it's not quite as fun as The Force Awakens. I didn't quite get into the characters as much as I did in Force Awakens. Um, but I really enjoyed the movie. I liked kind of a lot of the creative choices that J.J. Abrams did. So I think that's definitely something beneficial instead of if Rian Johnson just hopped on board for this movie also. So there's things I like about it. There's definitely highlights in it. There's things about it that are a little predictable to me, and it doesn't really help that I've been one of those people that kind of been researching Star Wars videos on YouTube and have listened to documentaries about what George Lucas probably would have done if he did his own sequel trilogy at one point. And believe it or not, there's certain things that George Lucas had in mind for a sequel trilogy that kind of make their way into this movie, believe it or not. So I think that was kind of interesting that J.J. Abrams kind of did a little research himself, kind of went back to those notes that George Lucas had from way, way back in the day, and kind of incorporated them a little bit into this supposedly final Star Wars movie. So I thought that was kind of interesting as a Star Wars fan. But my overall positives and negatives of Star Wars, Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker. Like I said, one of my biggest positives is that it does continue and wrap up the 9-film series. It does wrap up the prequels. It wraps up the original trilogy, wraps up this new trilogy. It does a lot of things in the spirit of Return of the Jedi, of how that film kind of ended everything. But there's a couple things they did every once in a while that are kind of its own little thing that I liked, that I appreciated, that wasn't directly from Return of the Jedi back when that film was trying to wrap up everything. So I like how it kind of overall wrapped up everything and it wasn't just another Star Wars movie. There's also a lot of homages to earlier Star Wars films, specifically Return of the Jedi, but there's also things in it here that are homages to earlier Star Wars films like Empire Strikes Back. Whenever you see Lando Calrissian, there's homages to like certain kind of imagery, certain kind of moments that happen in earlier Star Wars films that are really big moments. So there's certain things in here that I would even say there's even an homage to Luke walking. Remember in Empire Strikes Back when he walks through that dark forest and he kind of sees an evil version of himself when he takes out what he thought was Darth Vader, but really was himself in a Darth Vader outfit. So there's things like that that really kind of represent earlier Star Wars films. So kind of cool little homages they did there that I thought really helped the film and kind of really makes you know that this is kind of the final one, and that there's kind of cool nods to earlier Star Wars films along the way too. I also thought they handled the death of Carrie Fisher very well, whether that was digging through archive footage, whether that really truly was looking at every take of Force Awakens and Last Jedi of scenes that she was in and anything they could have used to really make it feel like she was there on set for this movie. So I thought they handled that very, very well here. There was rumors at one point that they potentially were thinking of recasting Carrie Fisher. I don't know how I would have felt about that. I kind of agree with Disney. I think using archive footage, using the actual actress that would have played this character if she was still alive, I think was the right choice. So I'm sure it was very hard for the people working on this movie. I'm sure they had to look through everything that it was in the Disney vault that had Star Wars related things in it, like Force Awakens and Last Jedi and all that. But I personally thought that they handled it very, very well here. This film also does provide big answers to big questions in the Star Wars universe, specifically with two characters, specifically with two newer characters of this newer trilogy. So I thought that was cool to kind of give these newer characters a wrap up because, you know, they can't make this thing go on forever. They have to wrap it up in some way. So there is a lot of newer characters that kind of have their own little wrap up on top of other bigger characters like Luke Skywalker and all of them that kind of get their own little final send off here too. So I liked how they did have big answers to big questions that I'm sure all of us have had on our minds throughout the Star Wars franchise. This film also does have great action and great visuals. J.J. Abrams handles that very well in this movie. The action scenes are very well handled. The visuals are very good. Similar to Force Awakens, I think he tried to do things practically where he could. There's a couple of moments here, though, where you can tell they probably had to use CGI again, like with the porgs and things like that. But overall, great action, great visuals. Very happy with this movie. For my negatives of Star Wars Episode 9, though, the film does jump around in the story a lot, so I don't know if that was just J.J. Abrams trying to make up for things that maybe Colin Trevorrow was going to do with his Episode 9 Star Wars movie, or they just couldn't do certain things with the death of Carrie Fisher, but there is a lot of jumping around, specifically in the first half of the film, where they go to one planet, they do a certain thing, they go to another planet, they do a certain thing, they go to this planet and do a certain thing, Kylo Ren is off doing this certain thing, Leia Organa's off doing this thing, doing this certain thing. So there's just a lot of jumping around where it doesn't really feel cohesive as a whole. It just feels like it's kind of jumping around, grabbing things from certain parts of the universe at that certain point in time. There's also a lot of big plot holes. One big one that I really can't get into too much detail on, but it does kind of not match up with what happened at the end of Return of the Jedi, is I guess the best way to say it. They never really address how this character came back. Is probably one of my biggest pet peeves with this movie, is they really didn't explain how that character came back. Because for anybody who saw Return of the Jedi, and maybe have even paused the screen for when this certain character supposedly disappeared for good, I'm pretty sure that character's dead. So I don't know how they never really addressed this. We were just like, oh, hey, he's still here. He's just doing this thing, and yeah, he's still here. So I thought that was kind of a gaping pothole in this movie. There's just a lot of things that go unexplained. There's like scenes where Lando Calrissian shows up at random points in time, and there's even kind of points in time where like, why didn't they just use Lando earlier? Why didn't he just show up earlier and help out earlier? Why is he showing up now and not in like Last Jedi or Force Awakens or anything like that? So certain things like that I think could have been addressed a little bit more. And like I said, there is some pretty big potholes in this movie, unfortunately. I also thought the film felt like more of like a series of events instead of a main storyline. Because when you watch Force Awakens, that's one big storyline. That's one big cohesive whole of a story of a movie. Even with Last Jedi, yeah, there's things about it that aren't very good, but like at least that movie's one big story, one big cohesive whole. And once again, I don't know if the death of Carrie Fisher interfered with this or not, but it just kind of felt like a series of events more than an overall cohesive story. So that's one aspect of the film I thought that could have been improved a lot, is just make it feel more like a story rather than a series of events. I also thought there were some really obvious nods to Return of the Jedi. There's just certain moments where you can felt creatively they were kind of lost as to how can we wrap up this really big story that's wrapping up 9 films. There's a couple of little nods to Return of the Jedi where you can just tell that even the filmmakers themselves are kind of lost creatively of what they could possibly do at this point. And there's a really obvious Return of the Jedi nod at one point towards the end of the movie, but certain moments just kind of felt creatively bankrupt to me, so I thought that aspect of the film could have also been a little bit better also. And overall, this film is a little predictable. We kind of know that certain things are going to have a happy ending. We kind of know that all the evil characters are going to have their karma in the end and kind of get bitten in the butt and kind of had what coming to them and things like that. There's just a little things in the film that are a little predictable that you kind of know have to happen in order to wrap up the Star Wars franchise. So I thought that aspect of the film was a little predictable to me. But overall, Star Wars Episode 9, I'm going to give it an 8.5 out of 10. It's a very enjoyable film. It's a nice little Star Wars installment that we can add to our Star Wars collection. Like I said, it does wrap up all 9 films, so I got to give J.J. Abrams credit for that, as he did wrap up not only a film, but 9 films of a franchise. It does continue the series very well. It homages earlier Star Wars films in sometimes creative ways. Some of those homages are a little lazy to me. It did handle the death of Carrie Fisher very well. There's great action, great visuals, and it does ultimately answer some big questions that I'm sure we all had about Star Wars, and it does answer them in, for the most part, very good fashion. So Star Wars Episode 9, I'm going to give it an 8.5 out of 10. I recommend seeing the film, and if you're a big Star Wars fan, I recommend checking it out.